Professor William Bolcom, one of America's most distinguished composers. He's written a wonderful work for the Verdehr Trio, and I'm going to ask him some questions about the trio, how it originated. Bill, I wanted to ask you how you begin composing a piece. Would you mind describing that process to us? I'm interested, are you more influenced by the instruments, by the number of instruments, or by the personalities?
First comes the people I'm writing for.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah,
yes.
I think that what I like to do is to have as clear an idea of whom I'm writing for without having necessarily gotten too close, in a certain sense that, well, here's a case. My wife, Joan, whom I now write for without any compunction, I could write a song for her when I first met her. Then there was a good half a dozen years in there. Meantime, when she becomes my wife and my life partner and all the rest of it, it was very hard to write for her. And everybody said, why can't you write for Joan? He says, well, I'm too close to her. And then after 6 years, I still am very close to her, but I was able in some part of my mind to decide, here's the love of my life, and this is also mezzo-soprano. Here's her range, this is where her break is, and things like that. And so having known what she can do, I could look at her both as my life partner, but also as somebody who had all these characteristics. Yeah. And it made a terrific help to have something unabstract. I don't like to write for clarinetists. I'd rather write for Elsa. You see what I'm saying? The point is that way I have a kind of, it gives a certain kind of roundness to the thing. You're writing for the person. You're hoping that that person will somehow relate to what you've written for them. Yes. And this makes a very different kind of atmosphere. I think it fills out the character of each of the parts of the piece. And strangely and paradoxically enough, the closer you've written for somebody, unless that person has a very characteristic something nobody else can do, the stronger the fit, the easier it is for somebody else to go and crawl into that same thing and find his or her own reading on the piece, because it's not been written abstractly. It's not been written for generic players. It's been written for somebody. Yeah. And another person can come on, and I've seen this happen over and over, and that's, of course, the fun part, and find an entirely different interpretation, and yet it will also be valid because it's an interpretation of a real piece that's been focused and in concrete reality for somebody to play.
I wanted to ask you also about the instruments. Do you, what character do you ascribe to the violin, to the clarinet, to the piano? Can you tell us if that influences you when you write for us?
I think my operative fallacy, which I've used for years and years, is that I imagine myself being able to play or sing and other things I can't do. I can't play the violin. I can't play the clarinet. I really can't sing with sour apples. I have an awful voice, but I have spent most of my time...
What do you imagine?
Imagining, it's very silly. It's me doing them. Yeah. So I'm imagining I'm being every one of those people. Now, it's a little easier to imagine yourself being a pianist because I'm a pianist. Yeah. But that's, I mean, I've written a certain amount of piano music, a couple of books of etudes, old 22 or some rags and things like that, but I haven't written lots and lots and lots and lots of piano music because the idea of imagining myself as a pianist isn't the leap as it is for me to imagine me playing the violin or playing the clarinet. What I tried to do is personalize, not only in terms of the person I have here, but what if I were that person? So the fun is the tension between what I would have done were it me playing that instrument and what I can imagine that person doing, and that's a very fruitful tension. That brings out some kind of a strange electricity, which I think maybe has something to do with producing the piece. It sounds very mystical, but I think it's actually very practical. So my whole point is to imagine myself doing this. I've always loved the clarinet. I wish I could play it properly. When I was in junior high school, the junior high school band director gave me a few clarinet lessons. I was so bad that after 6 weeks he asked me if I'd stop. I couldn't keep it from squeaking. And my experience with violin was hardly less discouraging. What happened was that we had an old 3/4 size violin that had somehow come down through the family. And I started taking lessons for that, and I got left in the back seat, and the car was unlocked, and somebody took it, and that was the end of my violin lessons. But then what I did is I found out the way to write for somebody was to badger players. And so I became the kind of student when I was going to music school that somebody would see coming and they would duck quick into the practice room, because otherwise I might buttonhole them and ask them to play something or try something out. And I made a pest of myself, but that's how I learned how to write for these instruments.
Yeah. It occurs to me, I remember William Schumann saying that he always got up at 6 in the morning and he worked from 6 to 10 at his desk. It doesn't sound to me like that's the way you work, but
well, in the way I found it, it was true. I do get up at
you
6.
just set up a certain time frame that's yours to compose.
I try to make it early because that's before the phone hits, just before all of the other things the world seems to want out of you start coming in from every direction, and it's very difficult sometimes to get that kind of concentration. I never, however, have gone to any of those things like MacDowell or Yaddo to get away from it all. I suppose it might happen with me. I'd get there and nothing would come. I seem to not be able to disengage completely.
Yeah.
But what I do try to do is to find time where I can have my own thoughts. I've also learned, as anybody who's had to work in theater in their lives, or anything that has to be done on time, to work anywhere. I can work in hotel rooms. I sketched out the middle movement of my Third Symphony in a middle seat between here and Detroit, here from the Detroit airport going back to New York. And I sketched it out there. I remember very well. I sat down, I had just had a yellow pad, and I sketched all the main things, and there it was. But it's just because I've had to learn to do this.
Yes.
And this comes partly because of the fact that I'm also a performing musician. Joan and I have a full concert schedule. And we do some 30 concerts a year. It used to be 50, and we just somebody got them down now to the point where we are fewer, but we still are on the road a lot. I have the little jottings, and I put them down into a big, I got an old mail bin that I put them all into, like a morgue. And then when it gets to a certain height, it's ready to start on the piece.
So in other words, motives and
all those things
ideas.
sort of put, they do have motives, ideas, and jottings, simple things. Same thing happened with you. I probably have about 10 pages of little jottings and so on and so forth. The day comes when I can visualize and imagine the first page, then I know I can start the piece. At which point, then the rest of the thing tends to fall into place. But it's got to be it's got to all be together in my head before I really start. Not every detail.
Yeah.
That would be very boring, because I like to be surprised when I come to a certain turn in the road.
Yeah, so you don't just go from beginning to...
I want to know where I want to end up, but I don't want to take the superhighway. I want to go all the byways. I want to end up, it's like, can you imagine 3.5 hours driving from here to Lansing, only interesting little country roads, and one could. You find the side, but you don't go 96, because you know that way and don't look at it. So a piece will be, how do you get from A to B, but in an interesting way.
Let me get back to our trio, your trio, our trio. And you had some interesting explanations or thoughts about what influenced you about to write the way you did, and would you mind just telling us a little about that?
What was the year I did that for you folks? 1990 maybe? It must have been 10 years maybe.
No, a little bit later, 93.
It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think back of what it was.
The slow movement is kind of, you said you had memories of your theory teacher?
Well, actually, it was my old composition teacher. I had two people that I studied with when I was a boy. One of them is still alive in his 90s now. His name was John Verrill. He'd gone to the Royal College of Music, but he was from Britt, Iowa. And he taught at the University of Michigan. I'm sorry, he taught at the University of Washington. And I was living either in Seattle or in small towns, mill towns around Seattle, and I would go to see him at the university or go to his house and study with him there. And he had a very particular atmosphere about his music, a certain kind of wistfulness and a kind of Brahmsian atmosphere, a little bit about it. And so something in that slow movement, I think, picked up that atmosphere of a kind of... So that was one of the things that was central. I was interested in two kind of doubles in this particular piece. There are like two big movements, each of which has two movements in them.
Yeah.
So you have the first movement and the second movement, which is attacca, and then you have the third movement and fourth movement. So you have like a balanced structure of two doubles.
Yeah.
And why that was sort of important is something I can't remember at this point because several eons since I've written the piece, but that was obviously something that was in my mind at the time.
Well, you have such a kind of rich variety of moods and even styles in the first movement being so rugged and dramatic.
This very strange mazurka.
The strange mazurka, it's a dream-like mazurka.
Kind of Kafkaesque mazurka.
Yes.
What did you feel, Walter, when you first looked at that music?
Well, we didn't know what to make of the first movement to begin with. I mean, it's clear musically and so forth, but again, it's like getting to know somebody. And of course, we found the drama very appealing, and as you say, kind of that juxtaposition of the very dramatic and then the quiet, whispering kind of.
Second movement,
Yeah, and even in the first movement, that very quiet part.
Right,
And then the second movement was very appealing, and I thought it was very important to give it the mazurka sort of feeling to.
Oh yeah, very much so. It's like
a color.
Yeah.
And then the third movement you talk about, but then the interesting introduction in the violin, that kind of sobbing effect.
Sobbing sound, yeah. That's one of the things that happens in dreams. I have certain pieces that come to me, bits of them in dreams. I've even visualized them in dreams. I've seen the whole music score in front of me, and I get up and I write it down. This happened to me sometimes.
Really?
That's one of those passages. I remember finding that in the score that was there, and I knew that's what was supposed to happen. That's what takes you out of the kind of dreamlike feeling of that slow movement to the last part, which is really very frenetic and fast and quite... and tragic in a way.
Yes, right. It's the Furies or something.
Yeah. Well, it's called a dithyramb, which is exactly that. That is what the Furies dance when they tear Orpheus to pieces. So that was very much in my mind. It was a very dramatic piece.
It really is.
Yeah.
Can I go back to the subject of Mr. Milhaud?
Sure.
Milhaud, excuse me.
Well, you know, I think that's he was Milo before the Second World War.
Oh, really?
After the Second World War, he became Mio, and I have no idea why.
I thought maybe there's a correct pronunciation.
Well, there probably are too. I imagine there might even be a branch of the Milos who are still Milo. But Mio has been Mio all these many years. I knew him. I met him first in 1957, and I understood it was a change in pronunciation somewhere around the war. I don't know why.
Well, I'm curious now, how long did you actually, I mean, do you consider him a teacher then, an influential teacher on you?
A very influential teacher, but he also, of course, became like a friend. But that was also true with most of the teachers I had. But with him it was very close because we had so much of the same mind. I met him in 1957 at Aspen. Mm-hmm. And I'd gone there on a scholarship, and I was 19, and he asked me to write a symphony, which I did. That's been recorded by Louisville. And that was my, well, I mean, I'd written some orchestra music, but this was one that I really wanted to, you know, and it's actually been recorded by Lawrence Leighton Smith about 10 years ago. It's out, you know, you can get it if you can get first edition records. Yeah. But I did that for that particular time. He was very happy with me and did what he could to bring me to Mills College in California, where he was teaching, and then got me a scholarship to go to the Paris Conservatory on the French government grant, which meant that we worked together really one-on-one for about only 2 years and a little bit, and I would come by and see him in Aspen a couple of summers and things like that. But it was more a matter of, you know, keeping tabs.
And can I ask, was he, did you feel he was very influential in showing you how to work or in influencing you as to the style, your style?
Oh, I think I was just attracted to Mio because of what I liked about his music and his whole attitude, and it was as much of an example as anything else. He didn't have much patience with people who didn't come in with a fully developed technique, and I had, thankfully, already one by the time I came to see him. I had all the chops I'd needed. I did take counterpoint to get into the conservatoire with a famous lady named Madame Play, and I passed and got the prize and everything else, and I got in. There was no problem. That was easy enough, but it was good for me to do that because I could learn French counterpoint as it was played in the conservatoire, which is a very particular thing of its own. You know, once you start a fugue and a voice is in, it's got to stay in all the time. It's like getting on some infernal merry-go-round and you can't get off until it stops, you know, which Bach, of course, is rife with. That's lots of silent voices, which opens up the texture, but not in the conservatoire. So I had to learn to write a proper conservatoire fugue. I learned how to do the proper things. I'd learned how to do the choral variations. I had to do all the things you had to do. I had to make sure that I had to be able to write a tonal answer to the fugue and according to the way that the French conservatory stuff did. And I studied all this with this terribly tiny, wiry lady who was the widow of one of the great counterpoint teachers. So we would end up having 2 and 3 hour lessons instead of a half an hour lesson. The first half hour was spent purely on doing my exercises according to the French style. The other 2 hours, she said, I want you to do free contrapuntal pieces in a tonal style, never mind about the rules. And those are the ones we really poured over. And I did that for 6 months, and I think that was very useful, and I liked her very much. And it was because she was not interested in the rules anymore either. But I had to deal somehow with the tradition of the French Conservatoire and be able to get by with it, because my grant that had been given by the French Conservatory would only give me enough money to live if I was a regular student. If I were the foreign student kind of scholarship, then everything was 3 and 4 times as much money, and I didn't have it. I lived on $60 a month in those days. One could.
Wow.
Because of the fact I was a regular student. But it was also because it was interesting to me to find out whether I could best this thing.
Yeah.
Which I did.
Amazing. Yeah.
And it was all part of the thing. So I could walk in with that kind of thing. He was not interested in the kind of small detail, hands-on teaching. He wasn't that kind of teacher. If you'd gone to somebody to pick up that kind of technique, you would have been very disappointed in Mio. He would just not have patience with you to do that. He assumed that you had to come in with a full deck, and that I had, thankfully.
I was asking you if Mio tried to influence his students' stylistic direction, I guess.
No, he did not. In fact, that was one of the things that was particularly interesting about Mio, is that he was anything but an imposer of style. He actually, in our class, were 2 people who were very much Boulesian in their direction.
Yeah.
A dear friend of mine who was one of the major Israel composers had an entirely different direction. Me, who was still trying to find some kind of a place in the middle of all the things that interested me until I finally lit onto whatever it was.
Yeah.
But I think what he did do was to tell us when he heard something or looked at something whether he liked it or didn't. And he said, this is my feeling about it.
Yeah.
He didn't pretend to impose anything.
Yeah.
He did not turn you into a replica of himself. I think there are a lot of people who have found that was necessary. Also at the Conservatoire, weirdly enough, there was still a kind of a leftover influence of Lily Boulanger, who had been very important there. And when you did the concours every year, which are the every year contests, there were these pieces that were written by one of the other teachers' class. Now that person very carefully imposed a kind of a stylistic edge on things. He was known for crossing out whole pages of people's work and doing them over for them right there in class and so on. Well, his people won all the prizes, and ours hardly ever won anything at all.
Interesting.
And I won the first time around. I won what was called a deuxième accessit, which is like second honorable mention. And the second time I ended up actually winning a second prize. But you see, the point for me was not to win a prize. I was never going to be working in a conservatory in Bordeaux or in Metz, and I didnn't care, Nantes or somewhere like that. Yeah. And that's what these people were all competing for.
I see.
So I'd written the string quartet, which was played by one of the local string quartets. They had hired them for this thing. And the last movement suddenly got into this funny ragtimey thing that vaguely sounds like Rock of My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham. Well, I would have had a first prize except for that. I knocked myself right down to second prize.
I'm just interested with your style. Maybe it's what do you think is more accurate? Maybe just to say a kind of stylistic direction rather than a style. I mean, you referred to someone as being Boulesian and other people are romantic or whatever. Is it a silly question to ask you what?
It's one of those things that is hard to answer for yourself. But other people tell me I have a style, so I guess it must be true. I think that style and form and all those things have probably been artificially separated in our minds. Style has a lot to do with, in fact, if you want to look at the biggest thing under the rubric of style, style really is everything. But form is a matter of getting something from A to B in a way that I hope doesn't bore you. To me, form is trying not to be boring. I think that one thing that Mio did say, which I have often quoted, I'll have to do it in translation, and that is that the profundity of a piece is in direct proportion to the boredom that it causes.
That's great.
And I think that to me the whole point is that once you have bored people, even if you're throwing them something that you say, well, you've got to be with this because it's so solemn and it's terribly important, and shame on you for being bored because this is profound and what's wrong with you, I would be, well, I always felt congenitally different about that whole business than when I was getting going, when people were very much interested, I think, in the 50s in, you know, some sort of a fake profundity. I also had the choice at one point of being interested in Hindemith or in Mio. There was, in those years in the 50s, a real kind of Hindemith or Mio point of view. And in those years, I think, felt the people who, well, I know around in Seattle when I was growing, they said, well, you should go study with Hindemith. Well, when I finally could go study, he had already left Yale, but I didn't know that, and nor did anybody there. So I had a choice of going to Yale for a full scholarship, presumably to study with Hindemith, but he was already gone. I didn't even know that until quite late. Or Mio for what was much less money, but I had to work in order to pick up the rest, but I wanted to go to Mio instead. I'd spent a summer with him. I had fallen a little bit out of love with Hindemith, having played all those sonatas for solo instrument and piano. After the fourth and fifth one, I said, well, I think I got the idea. I don't want to do any more of these. I think, you know, it began to feel kind of like a mill. And Mio was always fresher. And I found now, my friend Stephen Ships and I have put together this series of concerts we've done here now for 8 or 9 years, which are the Super Bowl alternative concerts. Now, how this happened, I know it's very nervy to do that here. What had happened is we had wanted to give a concert one January. The only free day was Super Bowl Sunday. So we said, what the heck, we will do it this way. For people who feel it's necessary at least to know what the scores are and the plays are, we will arrange it so somebody backstage in the recital hall can be watching the game, and between pieces they can come out and tell them the scores and the important plays. So that men could come and play hooky and pretend they'd watch the game.
Do you have any thoughts about where I mean, is there one overwhelming trend in which new music is going? Or what we've seen, of course, is a lot of different streams.
Oh, yeah.
Which I, as a performer, enjoy very much because
Sure.
I think it's very refreshing to have that possibility.
Well, it's wonderful to have a certain kind of multiplicity of direction.
Yeah.
I think what probably as much by force of circumstance as anything else, and maybe because of, well, William Albright, who was here and died a couple of years ago, and myself, and many of our students, there is a strong performer emphasis among our composers. Many of them are still quite good at performing and do so seriously. Derek Bermel has gone all over the place doing, for example, a lot of solo clarinet work.
Yeah.
He was one of 3 winners in the last half dozen years of their concerto competitions at the University of Michigan, and he and 2 other people have won over the regular studio musicians in concerto finals. One of them, Gordon Bieferman, won playing a Prokofiev concerto, again, over the regular piano majors. Another girl, Gabriella Frank, wrote her own piano concerto and again won over everyone else. So there is a strong tendency to keep that kind of practical musician attitude here. So I think if there's anything that might be, at least the tendency here, is this kind of hands-on performer approach. Pretty much everybody we have in our department now has been or still is an active performer. Bright Sheng is a wonderful pianist, also studied conducting under Leonard Bernstein, is a very excellent conductor and will be taking care of our contemporary ensemble next year. Evan Chambers is a fine folk fiddler and violist, regular, that part of his background. Susan Bhatti, who's just joined us, is a virtuoso soprano as well as a composer, and also has jazz background, having gone to Berklee School. Her husband is a jazz salsa composer and performer, and this is only part of their background. So I think that what we've found in our particular school, and among many of our students, has been a strong emphasis on being hands-on, on performing. They tend to form their own groups. they tend to, we have 5 concerts for young composition people anyway, called composers forums, but they manage somehow to scrabble together other concerts all year.
Yeah.
Senior recitals are usually dotted with commissions by the senior recitalist from some student composer or other.
Yeah.
And so it's been performance-oriented. And I think that's very much what makes our department quite different from a lot of the places where things have been much more theoretically oriented. And that's one of the reasons I think I've been here for all these many years. Yeah. I just finished, you won't believe this, a piano quintet for Isaac Stern,
Oh my goodness.
who evidently has got his bow arm back now. He had that carpal tunnel syndrome
did he?
operation. He was starting to play. People thought he was, he was playing like this, like a broomstick. And he seems to have gotten back his bowing technique
well,
again, which is
fantastic.
nice for an 80-year-old guy. They will premiere it on the 10th of March at the Library of Congress.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the great piece. I think it, you know, I feel it's a classic already. I'm
Well,
sure
thank you very much.
I think it
from-
will live.
From your mouth to God's ear.